Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second episode of Ride of the Rohirrim Catholic Podcast, exploring the truth, goodness, and beauty in the history of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Thank you so much for coming back, everyone, to those of you who saw the first episode, and welcome also to all of you who have not seen the first episode, who are joining us for the first time. I welcome you. This second episode is going to cover thousands of years, more years than I can count, of Middle-earth history. So it's going to cover a very expansive amount of time. And so I really want to kind of jump right into it and pick up exactly where we left off in episode 1. But first, before I do that, I just want to make a couple of corrections to certain things that I said in the first episode that, in retrospect, I wanted to amend. For example, when I spoke briefly about the Valar, also known as Lorien, I mentioned that he, along with his brother Namo or Mandos, are together known as the Feanturi, the Masters of Spirits. Now that is true, but I've left out one crucial, important part of Irmo's identity and his role as a Valar, is that he's known universally as a master of visions and dreams. So he is both the master of the gardens of Lorien and Aman, and as well as being the master of dreams and visions, and along with his brother, they are the masters of spirits, the Feanturi. Another phrase that I used in the first episode was the end of the fourth age. I misspoke. What I meant to say was the end of the third age and the dawn of the fourth. I can't recall right now in what context I used that phrase. All I know is that what I meant to say was the end of the third age and the dawn of the fourth. As we will see later on, we don't know anything about the end of the fourth age, considering that that's beyond the purview of Tolkien's written works. His written works only go up to the end of the third age and the dawn of the fourth age, which is, of course, the very ending of The Return of the King, the third volume, the third book of the Lord of the Rings. So I just wanted to clarify on those particular things. And I also wanted to clarify on the descriptions of two particular Maya spirits whom I mentioned in the first episode, in our prior episode. And they are Ose and Yuinen, the two Maya servants of the Vala Ulmo, who is the Lord of the Seas, the Lord of Waters. I didn't really speak much about Ose and Yuinen, and what I said was I had confused the two of them and the role that they played. Ose is really a lord of the waters of coastlands and of inland seas and inland streams. He considers his dominion, that's the word that Tolkien uses, to be over all of the coastlines of Middle-earth. And Yuinen, his wife, really has two main jobs. Well, firstly, she's described very beautifully and very intriguingly as having her hair float through every vein of the sea. In other words, you can't go anywhere in the sea and not be caught in the hair of Yuinen, which feels no different from the water, but her hair is literally one with the water. So I thought that was pretty cool. And she is known as the patroness of Numenor during the Second Age. Now, we're not going to talk about that until we get to the Second Age, but just know that for a long time she was known as the Maiar spirit, who was the patron of Numenor, of the kingdom of Numenor. And Yuinen's second role, on top of being the patroness of Numenor, was to restrain the wiles and the outbursts of her husband Ose. Now, why would Ose have outbursts? Well, remember, he is kind of the lord and the master of the coastlands of Middle-earth and inland streams, and any water that touches Middle-earth, that's his domain. Ose, at one point, was tempted by Melkor. We remember from the first episode that Melkor was the greatest of the Ainur, the greatest spirit that Illúvatar ever created. And he fell, as the greatest being could fall, to the most evil. He went from being the greatest good to the greatest evil. And then Melkor one day approached Ose and tempted him to turn against Illúvatar and against the will of the Valar, who were working Ilúvatar's work in the world, who were doing Ilúvatar's will in the world. And for a brief period, Ose listened to Melkor, and his turmoil and his turbulence of spirit caused the oceans and the waves to become violent and to kill and to become deadly. And it was only at the prayer of the Vala Aule that Yuinen, Ose's wife, was then prompted to bring her husband before the feet, not of Aule, but of Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, whom they both served. So Aule prays that Yuinen will bring her husband before the feet of Ulmo, and so she does. He's brought before the feet of Ulmo. Ulmo grants him pardon, and Ose and Yuinen, for the rest of their eternity, go on participating in carrying out the work of Illúvatar and of Ulmo, who represents Illúvatar. And even though there are times at which that former fiery anger that Melkor kind of treacherously instilled in Ose, it does resurface at certain times and cause Ose to cause these turbulent, violent storms on the seas. And it's during those times that Tolkien describes Yuinen, his wife, as restraining Ose, or restraining the wiles of Ose. So that's a little bit of clarification on things that I mentioned during last week's episode. Now let's really get into picking up exactly where we left off and continuing the history. So we're going to cover. Now I'm going to guess this, because to be completely forthright and honest with you, I don't know much about the chronology in terms of the set dates during which the events of the Silmarillion happened. I know that Men of the West, Civilization X, and RotR lore, you guys are very familiar with the chronology and the dating in terms of the years of the trees and First Age and Second Age. I don't know those dates so well, so I'm just going to go ahead and speak in general terms without giving specific dates. I believe we're covering about 1,000 years of history, or thousands of years of history at least, we will be covering in this episode. So where did we leave off? We really left off with the Ainur, including Melkor, the Valar, and the Maiar descending into newly created Arda after the music of the Ainur. And the question that we asked ourselves at the end of the last episode was this: will Melkor's role be a positive one, a constructive one, or a destructive one? Well, I don't think it's very surprising to learn that Melkor's role will be utterly destructive. He will descend into Arda along with his brother and sister Ainur, the other Valar, and everything that the Valar do to create and to beautify Ea, or Arda, the world, in order to bring it into the fullness of the vision that Illúvatar gave to them, all the efforts that they make are undone in their turn by Melkor. So Tolkien has this beautiful passage where he speaks about the Valar raising mountains and Melkor throwing them down, and the Valar delve valleys and Melkor raises mountains in those valleys, and the Valar create beautiful placid lakes, and then Melkor goes and takes those lakes and he turns them into turbulent streams and rapids. So everything that the Valar do, Melkor undoes it and makes it violent. He makes it turbulent. He makes it unworthy of the kingdom of Arda. He makes it contrary to the plan and the will of Illúvatar. He does this immediately after descending into Ea, into Arda, into the world that is. And so what happens? Well, it just so happens that there is one particular Vala who did not descend with Melkor and the other Valar initially. And while Melkor is causing all this turmoil and turbulence and chaos, this Vala is sent by Illúvatar out of the timeless halls into Ea, into the world, into the kingdom of Arda. And his coming causes Melkor fright and causes Melkor to flee, presumably with some of his compatriot evil fallen Maya spirits, and they go beyond the doors of night. They leave the confines of the world. They leave the circles of the world for a time. So what kind of Vala would instill such fear in Melkor that he would actually leave the confines of the world? Well, it's none other than Tulkas, the kind of Thor character of the Valar, with blonde hair and big muscles. He's the champion of the Valar. He takes joy in wrestling and contests of strength. That's the way that Tolkien describes him. His coming actually causes Melkor to flee in fear, which I think is a little bit comedic. That actually is exactly how the Cuenta Silmarillion opens up. In the very first chapter, almost the very first lines are Tulkas descending into Ea after the other Valar and Melkor fleeing in fear. So for a time, just for a brief time, Melkor and his fellow evil Maiar spirits, they kind of depart. So what happens during this time? Well, what begins is known as the Spring of Arda. I would believe that that's a term heavily associated with Yavanna, considering that Yavanna is the lady and the queen of all growing things, growing plants, and trees, and beautiful flowers, and everything that grows and is in abundance on earth. The spring of Arda begins after Melkor flees from Tulkas's presence, and during this spring of Arda, the world is one, the world is uniform, and if you were to look at a map, in particular, I would particularly recommend looking at the maps, not just for this moment in Middle-earth history, but if you want to look at an extremely accurate map from any period of Middle-earth history, I would direct you to the Atlas of Middle-earth written by Karen Wynne Fonstad. She created an atlas that is the result of her study of all of Tolkien's works, from the 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth to the Silmarillion to the Hobbit to the Lord of the Rings. She studied everything and compiled this great atlas. So I really recommend you reading that, or not even reading it, just looking at it, although there is text that accompanies it. If you were to look at Karen Wynne Fonstad's map of the period of Middle-earth during the spring of Arda, what you will see is completely unrecognizable from the map of both the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. Now, why is that? It's because this is before any of the changes to the world that will occur later on occurred. This is Middle-earth in its prime, Middle-earth in its heyday, Middle-earth as Illúvatar intended it to be. It's basically a gigantic round continent surrounded by the encircling seas, Achaea, the encircling seas. And this gigantic round continent is completely uniform, except in the very center where there is a great lake, and in the center of that lake is an island, the Isle of Almaren. The Isle of Almaren. And it is on that isle that the Valar set up their dwelling. To the north of Almaren and to the north of the Great Lake is raised the lamp or the light of Illuin in the north. And in the south, the brother or sister lamp is Ormal. So you have Illuin, the lamp of the north, and Ormal, the lamp of the south. And I just realized that I forgot to press play on the PowerPoint. This is great. Illuin in the north and Ormal in the south. So now what do I mean by these two lamps? Well, through the combined work of Yavanna and Varda and Aule and Manwe, lamps and devices of incomparable radiance and light and beauty are crafted. Essentially, the devices themselves are crafted by Aule. Varda puts her light into them. Manwe hollows them. And then those two lights are placed on top of great mighty pillars, taller, it is said, than any mountain in Arda that will ever be. These lights are placed on top of two pillars, Illuin in the north and Ormal in the south. And they are so bright that they cancel out the need for any sun and the need for any moon. In other words, the two lamps predate the sun and the moon in Middle-earth history. So Illuin is in the north and Ormal is in the south. So this is the spring of Arda. This is when Yavanna is bringing forth all kinds of creatures from the earth. You think of any beautiful creature, your puppy, your dog, or a beautiful bunny running through the grass, any beautiful creature. Just imagine it in the spring of Arda, a beautiful picture of Eden and of paradise, of the Garden of Eden. This is Middle-earth in its heyday, in its prime. It was perfect. It was beautiful, and Yavanna was making all things grow. Sadly, though, as you might expect, this was not to last. This was not going to last. This is what happens. Melkor, remember, retains the power that he had when he was still obeying the will of Illúvatar. He remains the most powerful, not only of the Valar, but of the Ainur. He remains the most powerful being that Illúvatar ever created. So in his evil, he retains that power and directs that power not for the good of Middle-earth, but towards its destruction. So in Catholic theology, we speak about how a great good, when it is endowed with great power, can become the greatest evil if it falls. In other words, if you take a good that is extremely powerful and cast it down and bring it into sin, it can become the greatest evil. And vice versa, then the greatest evil can also become the greatest good. So Melkor retains this power, so him fleeing in fear from the presence of Tulkas is certainly not the last that we're going to hear about Melkor. Melkor, along with his fellow Maya evil spirits, they're kind of spying on the activities of the Valar in Middle-earth. They're spying on the spring of Arda. And as Melkor spies on the spring of Arda, he becomes extremely, extremely enraged and angry. He sees the power and the beauty that Yavanna and the other Valar have created, and all he wants to do is destroy it. That's all he wants to do. He just wants to get rid of it and destroy it. So what does he do? He sends spies, Maya spirits who are allied to him, who have fallen, who are his spies. He sends them into Arda. They go to the Isle of Almaren, where the Valar dwell, and they pretend to be one of the good Maya spirits. And they spy out for Melkor, kind of gathering intel for him so that they can let him know when he has his moment to return. So this is happening. They're spying for Melkor, and at some point, Melkor finally decides that his time has come. He and his fellow evil Maiar spirits return from beyond the confines of the world. They re-enter Arda, and Melkor goes into the very far northern tip of Middle-earth, of Ea, of Arda, and he delves there with his fellow Maiar spirits, the fortress, the stronghold of Utumno, in the far north of Middle-earth, fenced by the mountains of Ered Engrin, the Iron Mountains, which are completely impenetrable. The Ered Engrin act as a natural barrier against any assault of the Valar on Utumno. So Utumno is a fortress that Melkor builds deep within the bowels of the earth. And actually, if you translate Utumno from the Elvish language, you get the word hell. Utumno literally means hell. The other translation that can be used for Utumno is actually Udun. So Udun and Utumno are two names for the same place, the same fortress of Melkor. Now, the name Udun might sound familiar to those of you who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings. Now, why is that? We're going to get to it later, so I'm not going to describe it in detail. But in the very northwestern corner of Mordor, which will be the kingdom of Sauron, Melkor's greatest servant in the second and third age, it's within the northwestern corner of Mordor that there's this region which Sauron has named Udun. Now, why would he have it named that? Perhaps because he remembered, because he could never forget, that Udun was the name of his master's greatest, strongest fortress in ancient history. Because Utumno or Udun is the greatest stronghold that Melkor will ever have. It is the strongest. So Melkor delves Utumno along with his fellow Maiar evil spirits. And then there comes a day when Tulkas and Aule finally rest from their labors. They have been among the most active in crafting Middle-earth and bringing it into being. Yavanna is probably the most active, but she really never stops her work. Tulkas and Aule come to this point, probably as all men who do like manual labor do. They say, you know what, I've had enough, I need a beer. Well, they didn't actually say that, but they were probably thinking that. You know, they needed a rest, they needed a break. It's time for them to kind of cease their labors for a while. And it just so happens that this is going to be a joyful occasion for Tulkas because he is about to espouse the Vala Nessa. So Tulkas and Nessa are about to get married in front of the entire pantheon of the Valar and the faithful Maiar, the good Maiar spirits. And this celebration is going to be held upon the Isle of Almaren. Naturally, because the Isle of Almaren is located in the middle of Middle-earth, there's not going to be very many beings outside of Almaren at the time that Tulkas and Nessa are being espoused. And remember, Aule at this point is resting too. So really there's not much vigilance being had over Middle-earth at the time that Tulkas and Nessa are being espoused. And so, because of his spies, Melkor knows that his time has finally come. He descends from Utumno, from the far north, and what does he do? He attacks and throws down the two lamps. the pillar of Iluin in the north and the pillar of Ormal in the south. He casts them down, he destroys them. And thus, all the light and the only light of Middle-earth is snuffed out. Middle-earth descends into a darkness without the light of the lamps. The fire, which had been the substance of the radiance of the two lamps, Iluin and Ormal, becomes a consuming fire that scours the land of Middle-earth, and it destroys and ruins all of the work of the Valar. Everything that they worked on, all the plants and the trees and the beautiful gardens that Yavanna planted, destroyed in an instant by the fire emanating from the ruins of Iluin and Ormal. Everything's destroyed. The work of the Valar ultimately and completely destroyed. Melkor retreats back to Utumno before either Tulkas or Manwë or Orome could overtake him. He barricades himself within Utumno, and the Valar do not go after him because they are too busy, as Tolkien puts it, restraining the tumults of the earth that resulted from the destruction of the two lamps. In other words, there's so much chaos caused by the destruction of Iluin and Ormal that the Valar need to spend all of their energy, all of their time, all of their power on saving whatever they can from this destruction. So this is an absolute and utter and complete victory for Melkor. This could not have gone better for him. This went practically perfectly for him. Now, it just so happens that the destruction of the two lamps caused such great chaos and turmoil within Arda, within Ea, that it actually caused the very first changing of the world. Now, throughout Middle-earth history, we're going to hear about several instances in which the world, and by the world, I mean the physical geography of Arda, being significantly changed by some sort of cataclysmic monumental event. There's going to be several times in which these changes of the world take place. This is the very first one, and there are going to be more to come. In fact, there will be one more change of the world during this very episode. But this is the first one, the first time that the world has changed. Those of you who have seen the Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring might remember that in the very beginning opening monologue of Galadriel, she says, "And the world was changed." That's kind of a subtle nod to the many instances in which the world was changed throughout the Legendarium and Tolkien's mythology. So this is the very time that the world has changed. How is the world changed? Well, Middle-earth goes from being a circular, uniform whole continent into being a world divided and scattered into three parts. In the far west, you have Aman, which will become the Blessed Realm, Valinor, the land of the Valar, the Deathless Shores, the Blessed Realm. You have Middle-earth in the middle, although that's kind of awkward to say. You have Middle-earth, which is also known as Endor. Now, I did not know that it was called Endor until I read Karen Wynne Fonstad's Atlas of Middle-earth. Apparently, the proper name for Middle-earth to distinguish it from Aman is Endor. So you have Aman, Endor, and then you have the lands of the Far East, which are pretty much for the most part unexplored and uninhabited, culminating in the lands of the Sun in the uttermost east. But we're not really concerned with that because Tolkien doesn't really speak much about the lands of the Far East. So we're really going to focus on Aman in the Far West and Endor, Middle-earth that's where almost all the action of the Silmarillion and the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings is going to take place. So let's really begin to talk about what the effects of this change of the world are. Well, because of the destruction that Melkor has wrought, the Valar depart from Middle-earth, they depart from Endor, and they make their abode, their dwelling, on the Deathless Shores in Aman, in the Blessed Realm. There are so many names for the Blessed Realm that I've kind of felt the need to kind of pick my favorite name. At this point, I would say that my favorite name is Aman, but my favorite title for the Blessed Realm would definitely be the Deathless Shores. I mean, it's just such a cool name. It's powerful. It makes the hairs on my arm stand up. It's the Deathless Shore. It's the land where nobody dies. It is the land of the blessed. It truly is the Blessed Realm. The Valar make their home on the Deathless Shores in Aman, in the Blessed Realm. And the name that they give to their home on the continent of Aman is Valinor. So I'll be using the terms Valinor, Aman, Blessed Realm, and Deathless Shores pretty much interchangeably. they all mean the same thing. They're referring to the westernmost lands of Arda, of the world, in which the Valar have their abode. And when the Valar take up residence in Valinor, they create the city of Valmar, Valmar of many bells, which is their city. That's where they live and work. Outside of the western gate of the city, you have the mound of Ezelohar, and you also have the Mahanaxar, which is the Ring of Doom, which is where Manwë will preside over councils in which he calls all of the Valar to council to discuss matters of great importance. Now, Ezelohar, the mound of Ezelohar, is where a great and momentous event is about to happen. Yavanna, terribly, terribly grieved at what has happened to the two lamps, she goes to the mound of Ezelohar, again outside of the western gate of Valmar, and she begins to chant, which it's basically a prayer. Tolkien describes it as a prayer to Illúvatar. And as she's chanting and she's working the blessings that she has been given by Illúvatar, those blessings are working through her, and out of it come the two trees of Valinor, springing up from the ground on the mound of Ezelohar. Those two trees are named Telperion and Laurelin. Telperion and Laurelin. Telperion is the elder, the older of the two trees, and it is a silver tree. Now, even though it is a silver tree, it will be referred to later on in the text as the white tree. Telperion will be called the white tree. It's synonymous. Telperion is the silver or white tree, and Laurelin is the golden one. Now, Telperion has green leaves with a silver, kind of a silver hue on the bottom of the green, while Laurelin is said to drip gold or to drip golden light from its boughs. They're these two beautiful heavenly trees. And underneath the trees, Yavanna sets up great vats to collect the dew that falls from the leaves on the two trees. And all of the Valar are present when Yavanna makes the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin, grow. They're all present to see it happen. So these are some of the things that are going on in Valinor when the Valar take up their residence there. Another significant thing that the Valar do is that Manwë sets up his high seat upon the tallest peak in all of Arda, probably not likely to be as tall as Iluin and Ormal were in the past, but as of right now, at this point in Middle-earth history, this is the tallest peak in all of Arda. Manwë sets up his throne and his high seat at the very summit and pinnacle of this tallest peak, and the name of this peak is Taniquetil. And it is from upon Taniquetil that Manwë looks out upon all of Arda, and the mountain is said to be so high that Manwë can see all of Arda, he can see all of Middle-earth, he can see the entire Ea, the entire world that is. Now, is that probably really due to the height of the mountain? No. I would suggest that that's due to the blessings that Illúvatar has endowed Manwë with. Now, remember how powerful Manwë is. Not only is he the Lord of the Valar, and thus now, after Melkor's fall, the greatest Ainur, but he is also Illúvatar's Vicar. Remember that Illúvatar chooses Manwë among all of the Valar after Melkor's fall to be his representative in Arda, in Ea. Remember that Illúvatar resides outside of Ea, in the timeless halls. Illúvatar is apart from the world. And so Manwë, in a way, acts as his vicar, or his representative, before the other Ainur, and before who will eventually be the children of Illúvatar, the Elves and men, and the other races of Middle-earth. So Manwë, with his seat upon Taniquetil really becomes a kind of holy mountain. You know, as a Catholic, I can't help but see imagery here of St. Peter and of the popes and them being vicars of Christ. And I can kind of see here the Catholic imagination that Tolkien had and how it would have led him to include in his mythology this holy mountain upon which a vicar of God sits and has his seat, from which he looks out on all the world, which is his province, all the world which he cares for and which he shepherds. It's really a biblical image, and it's very, very beautiful. So there is absolute and utter bliss going on in the Blessed Realm. Something kind of odd happens. The collective power of the Valar is put together, and they are unified in creating the walls of the Pelori, or the mountains of Aman. The Pelori Mountains are raised by the Valar as a defense on the eastern flank of the continent of Aman, as a defense against both Melkor over in Middle-earth and against the Great Sea of Belagir. So, in other words, if you were to look at a map of Aman, you would see that it's shaped like a crescent moon. And along the easternmost flank of this crescent moon are the walls or the mountains of the Pelori. The Valar raised these mountains as a defenses against Melkor in the wake of his destruction of the two lamps, which only makes sense. Now, this would kind of beg the question, how are the Valar going to be welcoming to the children of Illúvatar if they raise these great mountains against any approach from Middle-earth? And now we know that the children of Illúvatar are going to awake at some point in some place within Middle-earth. How are they going to be welcomed if these great, terrifying, intimidating walls, these black mountains, are raised against any coming from the outer lands to the Blessed Realm? Well, we're going to get to that later on in this episode. But suffice it for now to say that it only makes sense why the Valar would raise the wall or the mountains of the Pelori. So we have Manwë sets up his throne upon Taniquetil. We have Ezelohar, the Mound of the Two Trees. Yavanna plants and grows the two trees through her prayer to Illúvatar. And the Valar are basically living in bliss. And Tolkien actually says that Valinor is made to be more beautiful, more resplendent, more glorious than Middle-earth ever was during the spring of Arda prior to the destruction of Ilúin and Ormael, the two lamps. That's a very powerful thing. It's more beautiful after the destruction than before. And I think that kind of goes against Melkor's wishes, wouldn't you think? Now, well, let's return to Middle-earth. What is going on with Melkor? Remember, he's just had this amazing victory. So what is he doing now? Well, when he hears tell of the creation of Valinor and the Blessed Realm in Aman, what he does is he commands that a second fortress be built for him far in the northwest of Middle-earth as a defense for Utumno against any assault that might come from Valinor. And the name of this second fortress, not far from the shores of Middle-earth, in the far northwest corner, is called Angband. So you have Angband in the far northwest, and Utumno in the far north and in the east. Angband is a defense for Utumno, and who does Melkor put in command of Angband? None other than Sauron. Not surprising, is it? Sauron is going to come up quite a bit in the history of the Silmarillion. So his appearance in The Lord of the Rings is not his first appearance in Tolkien's works. He goes all the way back to the ancient days. Sauron. He is put in control of Angband. Now, Tolkien makes it very clear, because he repeats himself over and over and over and over again in these early chapters of the Silmarillion, that the Valar have not forsaken the outer lands, which is kind of a title that is used for Middle-earth. They have not forsaken the outer lands. It would certainly seem that way, considering that they're living in bliss and they've raised these great mountains to block out any approach from the outside world. But Tolkien makes it very clear that the vigilance of the Valar has not decreased in any way since the spring of Arda. In fact, I would suggest that Manwë, Varda, Aule, Orome, and Yavanna are among the most vigilant of the Valar in terms of how greatly their thought and their prayer and their wills are directed and constantly directed towards the plight and the fate of the soon-to-be awakened children of Illúvatar in the outer lands. They are constantly thinking about what will become of Ilúvatar's children when they finally awake in the outer lands in Middle-earth. I would suggest that the most concerned about this would be Manwë. Um, it's constant, it's very consistent motif that Tolkien uses throughout the text of the Silmarillion, that Manwë and Melkor are constantly in strife. Melkor strikes, Manwë strikes. Melkor strikes, Manwë strikes. You certainly get the sense of Christ and Antichrist between the two of them, which is ironic because they're brothers. It's explicitly told to us in the text of the Silmarillion that in the thought of Ilúvatar, in the mind of Ilúvatar, Manwë and Melkor were brothers. The two greatest beings that he ever created, brothers. One wholly good and one wholly evil. So it's pretty clear that there's no way in which Manwë has lost care for the coming children of Ilúvatar. And I would say underneath Manwë, the most vigilant of the Valar in awaiting the coming of the children of Ilúvatar is without question, Varda. Without any question, I can tell you right now that would be Varda, Elbereth in the later tongue of the Elves. What does Varda do to prepare for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar? Well, she creates the stars. How about that? What a great way to prepare for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar than by creating the flipping stars. I mean, that's awesome. Varda creates the stars. And hence she one day earns the title of Tintale, the kindler, and also Elentari, queen of the stars. So Varda, Elbereth, Tintale, Elentari, the queen of the stars. Varda. So how does she create the stars? She actually takes the dews that have fallen into the vats of Yavanna, the dew from Telperion, the white tree, the silver tree. She takes that silver white dew and casts them into the heavens with the power that has been given to her by Ilúvatar, and so she creates the stars. There are so many stars that are mentioned: Alcarinque, Soronume, trying to think now, Nenar and Lumbar, Elemire. There's so many stars mentioned, but I'm really going to focus on two, the two most important constellations or stars. It's not really clear whether they're individual constellations or individual stars that Varda creates at this point. She creates Menel Makar, which is the phrase that is used to describe Menel Makar is the shining belt. And Menel Makar is said to be the sign in the heavens of the last battle, or the Dagor Dagorath. Now, I will be candid with you. The only instances in which I've learned or heard about the Dagor Dagorath are in the lessons that I've learned from Civilization X, from Men of the West, and from Geek Zone Loader Lore. You guys have told me everything that I know about the Dagor Dagorath. I will repeat to you what they have told me, and they deserve the credit for anything that I say about it because I've learned it only from them. The Dagor Dagorath is said to be the final cataclysmic apocalyptic battle to occur at the end of time within the history of Middle-earth, during which Melkor, Sauron, and all the forces of good and all the forces of evil will return for one great final battle, during which Sauron and Melkor are finally destroyed. The world is made anew, and the second music of the Ainur is finally sung before the throne of Ilúvatar. That, in short, is what the last battle is. Now, I have also learned that it is in debate whether or not the last battle is actually canon within the collection of Tolkien's writings. Was it really a part of Tolkien's history and the history that he intended to create for Middle-earth? The writing and the comments of Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son and literary executor, suggest that it is not really part of the canon. But because it is mentioned in the published Silmarillion, I feel the need to mention it, just as you guys from Men of the West and Loader Lore, Geek Zone, and Civilization X mentioned it. I feel the need to mention it here. Menel Makar is said to be the sign of the Dagor Dagorath, or the last battle, which again would be a pretty scary sign to Melkor, considering that he must know, in fact, what's going to happen in the Dagor Dagorath. I would assume that Melkor knows certainly more than I know about the Dagor Dagorath. Varda creates the Menel Makar, and the other major star that she creates is known as the Valasirka. The Valasirka. The Valasirka, the phrase that's applied to that is the sickle of the Valar, the sickle of the Valar. You know, like that farming tool that you would use to kind of cut down wheat and chaff when you're harvesting wheat. It's called the sickle of the Valar. It is said to be a crown of 7 stars. That's what Valasirka is. It's a collection, a constellation of 7 stars forming a crown, which Varda sets in the far north of Middle-earth, nigh akin to Angband and Utumno, as a challenge to Melkor and a sign of his downfall and his doom. Now, let me tell you something. That gives me goosebumps. That Varda, who Melkor most hates and who he most fears among the Valar, creates a constellation right above his own evil fortresses, a constellation that speaks of that his doom is coming. Now, how epic is that? That's pretty epic. That was one of my absolute favorite lines in the Silmarillion, was when I learned that Varda created the Valasirka as a challenge to Melkor, her greatest enemy, and a sign of his impending doom. That was just amazing. One other thing that I forgot to mention was that the reason, the primary motivator or impetus for Varda creating the stars was the Valar meeting in council in Valinor and really speaking about what are the things that they're going to do to prepare for the coming of the children of Illúvatar. Now it is time to take a kind of sidebar and speak about a topic that I'm sure many of you are excited to hear about. I'm certainly excited to talk about it, is the creation of the dwarves. Because it's at this point in the Silmarillion that Tolkien includes the short history or the short story about how and why the dwarves are created. Well, Aule, we know, is the master craftsman of the Valar. He is the greatest in making things with his hands. And it just so happens that there comes a point when he, like Melkor, before the music of the Ainur, grows impatient during the waiting period during which he and the other Valar are waiting for the children of Illúvatar to awaken in the Outer Lands. He's growing impatient. He wants life to finally come to this Middle Earth that he and his brother and sister Valar have worked so hard on. Now, what's different between Aule and Melkor is that Melkor was impatient because he wanted to create things of his own. He was greedy and selfish and self-centered and self-oriented about it. Whereas Aule is impatient because he wants life to come so that he can teach that life, so that he can bestow his blessings and his knowledge upon that life. It is not self-oriented, it's not self-directed, it is not really selfish. That's what makes Aule and Melkor different. Although their temperaments are somewhat the same, Aule is intrinsically good and Melkor is intrinsically evil. Now, I would suggest to you that Tolkien purposely describes Aule in the very same terms that he uses to describe Melkor to kind of bring about this comparison in the reader's mind. Aule is described as being very impatient. He wants the children of Illúvatar to finally come about. So in his impatience, what does he do? In his skill and in his power, he winds up creating the dwarves. Before even the Eldar, the Elves, the Quendi have awoken, Aule makes the dwarves. Where does he make the dwarves? Beneath the mountains of Endor, beneath the mountains of Middle-earth, Aule crafts the dwarves. And how does he craft the dwarves? He crafts first, or he makes first. It says weird to say crafts, consider that they're alive. He creates the 7 fathers of the dwarves, who will become famous throughout the Legendarium, especially in the history behind the Lord of the Rings. Aule creates the 7 fathers of the dwarves. And as he's interacting with them, teaching them the language that he wants them to speak, he hears Illúvatar speak to him. Uh-oh, trouble's coming. Dad is gonna ask his son, Like, where did these people come from, and why did you create them without asking me permission? In essence, that's exactly what Ilúvatar says to Aule, and Aule's response is both very humble and it's pretty touching. Aule responds to Ilúvatar's questioning of him, why did you do this? Why? And Ilúvatar very specifically says, why did you do what was beyond your power and your purpose? For I gave you a being that was only to be of your own, and you've gone and done what was outside of your purview and given being to other living beings, which you were not supposed to do. That's my job. So Aule did what Aule technically did in creating the dwarves was he usurped Ilúvatar's creative power and used it for himself when he wasn't supposed to. And Ilúvatar makes that point. He says, I gave you a being for you to have for yourself, not for you to go ahead and create other beings. In other words, Ilúvatar is pretty much reminding Aule, I'm the creator, not you. So why did you do this? And Aule's response, he says, when a son sees his father doing such beautiful things, how is it that he cannot attempt to copy his father, even if the replication of his father's work that he attempts is shabby and flimsy and not even close to the glory of his father's work? How could he not attempt it? A son watching his father and being proud of his father, and I think that this kind of, in a way, gets to Ilúvatar and kind of tugs at his heartstrings a little bit, because then what does Aule do? He says, yet now that I look at my creation, I see how little and nothing that they are compared to what you have created. And so in his humility, Aule decides that he's going to strike down and kill his creation. He's going to kill the seven fathers of the dwarves. But then, what does Ilúvatar do? As Aule is raising the hammer with tears in his eyes, and this is really beautifully illustrated in the illustration by Ted Nasmith in the illustrated edition of the Silmarillion, where Ted Nasmith painted a beautiful picture of this. Aule raises the hammer to strike down the seven fathers. He's got tears in his eyes, and then what happens? Ilúvatar, much like the angel taking the knife out of Abraham's hand when he's about to slay his son Isaac, Ilúvatar prevents Aule from striking down the seven dwarves, and he has mercy upon him. In his omniscience and his omnipotence and omnipresence, Ilúvatar knows that the dwarves are going to serve an important purpose in his plan. He's known about them since the beginning, since before anything happened. So he's merely interacting with Aule as if he doesn't know what's about to happen. But he knows what's about to happen. So he has mercy on Aule, and he says, I am going to basically adopt your creation as my own children. But know this, I will not suffer the children of my adoption to come before the children of my choice. And by the children of my choice, Ilúvatar is kind of making a reference to the Quendi, to the Elves, to the Firstborn. So he says, they're not going to come before my children. They're going to come after. So you and your children are going to await the coming of the Firstborn before they can awake. And you're going to take them and you're going to lay them to rest within the ground at the roots of the mountains in Middle-earth. And it is only at the appointed time that I have set that they will finally awaken after the coming of the Firstborn. So in other words, because of your impatience, you're now going to have to wait even longer to see your desires fulfilled, to see your creation come to fruition, come to flower. So the dwarves are not going to awaken until after the elves awaken. This is kind of the trade-off that Ilúvatar works out with Aule as a result of him having mercy on Aule. And Aule pretty much agrees to this. He lays the seven fathers of the dwarves down to rest, and he's waiting, and he's forced to be patient. And I think he learns a lot of virtue and humility in that waiting, virtue and humility that Melkor never gave himself the chance to learn during the music of the Ainur. So there's an interesting comparison there between Aule and Melkor himself. So now I would like to touch on Yavanna, Aule's wife. What's her response to her husband's creation of the dwarf? Well, it's pretty interesting. She approaches Aule in his smithy, in his workshop, and she pretty much says, your creations, they're going to hate everything that I love. And Aule says, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, I create things that grow. I create things of the earth. I create green things, beautiful things, sublime things, delicate things. And the work of your hands is not going to have any care for the work of my hands, except as a means to an end. In other words, the dwarves are not going to respect the creation, the animals and plants and the flora and fauna that Yavanna has adorned the earth with. They're not going to respect it for itself, but as a means to a further end. In other words, the dwarves are not going to admire Yavanna's trees, they're going to cut them down for wood. Essentially, that's one example of what Yavanna is talking about here. She has a very good point. How ironic is it that Aule goes and does this when his wife is the Vala of creation and of growth? Shouldn't he know that his creation they're really going to do a lot of damage on his wife's work? And Aule's response is pretty smart. He says that, well, I'm not making any excuses for my future creation, but I will say that you should know that the firstborn and the aftercomers, the children of Illúvatar, elves and men, they're going to have dominion over your creation, just like my dwarves will. So in other words, elves and men will be just as responsible for doing damage to your creation as my creation is. So you should really take that up with those who are in charge of the children of Illúvatar. Don't be too angry at me. And then that's essentially what Yavanna does. She goes to Manwë. She goes to Manwë beneath the two trees of Valinor. She goes to Manwë upon Taniquetil, and she has this long discussion with him where she describes her fear that both the dwarves, her husband's children, and elves and men, the children of Illúvatar, will have a kind of abusive dominion power over her own creation. And she asks Manwë, remember, because he's Illúvatar's Vicar, is this true? Are the children of Illúvatar really going to have dominion over my creation like my husband said? And Manwë says, yes, Aule hath spoken rightly. And then they kind of have this whole dialogue during which Yavanna expresses her desire that there should be protectors of her creation that are in fact part of her creation. In other words, she expresses her desire to Manwë that I wish that my nature had the power and the ability to defend itself against any usurpation and attacks from anything else, whether it be dwarves, elves, or men, or the fell creatures of Morgoth. Sorry, I shouldn't have said Morgoth. Melkor. Morgoth's coming in the next episode. I wish that my creation could defend itself. And then how does Manwë respond? He says, I think this is actually literally what the text says. He says, that's an interesting thought. That's an interesting thought. And then what does he do? He goes up, he sits on his seat upon Taniquetil, and he prays to Illúvatar, and he hears Illúvatar speak to his heart, speak to his soul. Then he goes down to Yavanna, sitting underneath the two trees, and Manwë sits with Yavanna underneath the two trees, and he speaks to her, and he delivers to her the message that Illúvatar has implanted in his heart. And what is that message? Well, Illúvatar grants Yavanna's prayer. He grants her defenders of her creation that arise from her own creation. And who are those defenders? The shepherds of the trees, who will come to be known in the Lord of the Rings as the Ents, of whom Treebeard is the most famous. Yes, the shepherds of the trees, the Ents, are actually ancient beings within Middle-earth, which might have been suggested to us in the many phrases and the things that Treebeard speaks to Merry and Pippin in the Two Towers, which we will get to later, I promise. We'll dissect in depth everything that Treebeard says. We'll go almost line by line, but that's for a future video. So yes, the shepherds of the trees are ordained in the divine plan, as revealed to us when Manwë prays to Illúvatar and Illúvatar speaks through him. But, as if it couldn't get any better, as kind of a side comment, Manwë speaks to Yavanna and he says, our two thoughts have not always, they have not really been wholly divergent. Do you recall that our two thoughts once flew together as a great eagle in the sky? So what Manwë is kind of saying there is, the desire that you had for a part of your own creation to be able to defend itself, I kind of had that same desire. So don't feel too alienated, because I kind of wish the same thing. And you know what? Ilúvatar granted my prayer too. And essentially, she's like, "Oh, well, what did you pray to him for?" And what's Manwe's response? Remember that Manwe is the Lord of skies. He's the Lord of all the airways of Middle Earth, of Arda. Manwe's response is, "The eagles of the lords of the west." So yes, indeed, both the Ents and the great eagles are the results of the prayers of Manwe and Yavanna to Ilúvatar to have elements of their own hand in the creation of the world be able to defend their respective sectors of the world. So the eagles defend the airs, no matter what is threatening the airways, be it fell beasts or some other creature. And you have the Ents protecting the trees, which is the province of Yavanna. Remember, because she is the lord, she is the lady and the queen of all things that grow within Arda, within the world. So there's how the creation of the dwarves comes about. We're going to continue to hear about them in future videos. But for now, the seven fathers of the dwarves are laid to rest at the roots of the mountains, and we're going to be hearing more of them later on. Especially, we're going to be hearing about the specific dwarf Durin, and about his awakening and his connection to the great dwarven colony of Khazad-dûm. But that, again, is something that we'll touch upon in a later video. The dwarves will be coming up again and again throughout the history of the Silmarillion. I promise. I promise you that. We're going to hear much more about the dwarves. I can guarantee you that. So let's continue. Let's press on. Let's continue on. So now we have Angband and Utumno in the north. We have the divine plan of the Ents and of the great eagles. So what happens now? Well, now it's finally time for the children of Ilúvatar to awaken. Now there are only two members of the Valar who ever go beyond the walls of the Pelori after the founding of Valinor. And those two members of the Valar are Orome the hunter and Yavanna. Yavanna goes because she has this great grief and this great desire to see her creation flower once more within Middle-earth. Now remember, nothing can grow in Middle-earth because it's completely in darkness. No longer do they have the light of the two lamps, and now the only light comes from the Blessed Realm, which is so far to the west, and fenced by the Pelori, mind you. It's so far to the west that none of the light of the Blessed Realm can at this point reach Middle-earth. Middle-earth is in darkness. So Yavanna and Orome are the only two Valar who ever go beyond the walls of the Pelori, directly following the spring of Arda and the destruction of the two lamps. Now, I should mention at this point that Middle-earth, as it stands now, is still very different from the Middle-earth that most of us are familiar with from the Lord of the Rings. Now, why is that? Because what we see on the map that's included within the Lord of the Rings is on the easternmost half of Middle-earth proper. In fact, there's an entire continent to the west of the map that we see in the Lord of the Rings. And, well, it's not really a continent. There's an entire half of a continent that's not included in the map of the Lord of the Rings, because that entire half of the continent is not a part of the history that surrounds the Lord of the Rings, and we'll get to that later. But what we need to remember is that throughout the history of the Silmarillion, when I refer to Middle-earth, I'm not really going to be referring that extensively to any of the lands that are to the east of the Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains, which rank the westernmost flank of Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings. We're not going to touch on anything east of the Ered Luin. We're going to be dealing with things west of the Ered Luin to the shores of Belagir and with Aman, the Blessed Realm. So what is this land between the Great Sea and the Blue Mountains? It's Beleriand. Beleriand is the name that is given to the region of Middle-earth that we will be studying throughout the history of the Silmarillion. Beleriand does not come into the history of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the reason for that will be discussed in a future video, I promise. But for now, just know that we're not dealing with the same areas of Middle-earth from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. We're dealing with a region that is specific to the Silmarillion, known as Beleriand, the westernmost lands of Middle-earth. So Yavanna and Orome are the only ones that venture beyond the Pelori. And so now what happens? During one of his rides, Orome is riding upon his horse Nahar, who glows silver in the moonlight. And he has the Valaroma, his great horn, in his hand. And it just so happens that he passes far, far east, passing farther than the land that will one day become Mordor in the future. Mordor doesn't exist yet, but he passes even farther east than Mordor one day will be. So he passes into the far east of Middle-earth. And he passes north upon reaching the shores of the inland sea of Helkar. So at this point, there's an inland sea that's known as Helkar in the far east of Middle-earth. He passes north along the coast of Helkar, and when he passes north, he comes, unbeknownst to him, along a bay of Helkar that has its own name. It's known as Cuivienen, the Water of Awakening. Why is it called the Water of Awakening? Here's why. Because as Orome, riding upon Nahar, passes Nayakin to the northern bay of Helkar, he hears, to his utter surprise, singing. He hears singing. Now, where exactly is this sea coming from? Where exactly is this singing coming from? Well, it's coming from the newly awakened firstborn children of Illúvatar, who call themselves the Quendi, those that speak, because as of yet, they have not heard anybody speak. They've only heard themselves speak, so they call themselves the Quendi, those that speak. Who are the Quendi? They are the Elves, the firstborn children of Illúvatar. They awaken by this northern bay of Helkar, which afterwards becomes known as Cuivienen, the Waters of Awakening. And Orome chances upon them, and he's absolutely and utterly astonished, to say the least. And he sees them, he hears their singing, he's utterly transfixed. Now, when I was reading this, I couldn't help but be reminded, and when I mean reminded, I mean like heavily, heavily reminded, of Frodo on the last ship from the Grey Havens, approaching the Blessed Realm, and what does Tolkien say he hears? He says he hears singing. And the gray rain curtain of the world was finally rolled back, and he heard the sound of singing, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. So just as Frodo will one day discover the beauty of the Blessed Realm at the end of his earthly pilgrimage, so at this point Orome, representing the Valar and in fact representing the Ainur, for the first time ever, powerful moment within Middle-earth history, encounters the beings that were promised to them in the music of the Ainur, in the third theme of the music of the Ainur. They encounter for the very first time the children of Illúvatar, the firstborn, the Quendi, the Elves. Orome dismounts Nahar, and he approaches the Quendi. Now, some of them flee in fear, don't get me wrong. Those that fled in fear had most likely fallen victim to the lies and the deceits that Melkor had spread abroad, knowing that the Elves had finally awakened by the northern bay of Helkar. He had sent spies, not only physical spies, but he'd sent out dark rumors and doubts and false stories to be spread through his servants among the Elves to spread fear of Orome. In other words, Melkor wants the Elves to fear Orome. So some of the Elves on Orome's approach flee, but the greater part of them, those that have wisdom, Tolkien says, they stay, with courage they stay, and they come close, they approach Orome. Why did they do this? Well, because they can tell, not only by his stature, but by the light of Aman, which resides in his face. Now, that's a motif we're going to be hearing over and over again throughout the Silmarillion, how the light of Aman lives in the faces of certain beings. We're going to hear it again with Melian the Maya. We're going to hear how the light of Aman lives in her face, too. So the Elves behold the light of Aman in the face of Orome, and he begins to teach them and to speak to them and to tell them who they are and where they come from and where he came from and who he represents. And he has this dialogue with them. And finally, he leaves. He departs back, with all speed. He rides back to Valinor across the grinding ice, across the Hel Caraxe, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny strip of land that connects Aman in its uttermost northeast, with Beleriand in its uttermost northwest. There's a tiny, tiny strip of land that connects them. Presumably, Orome rides Nahar across the Helcaraxe. He goes back to Valinor, back to Valimar, back to the Ring of Doom, and he reports back, the children have finally awakened. The firstborn have come. And the Valar gather in council, and they're full of joy. They're full with astonishment as Orome is describing to them how he heard the singing, and then he came to the waters of Cuivienen at the northernmost bay of Helkar, and he saw the firstborn children of Illúvatar, and they're absolutely, utterly astounded and amazed. And then Orome finally reports back to them, and the Quendi tell me that there are shadows that harass them around Cuivienen. And now the Valar, they know what's about to happen. They know the danger and the threat that is now posed to the Quendi residing along the shores of Cuivienen. These shadows that the Quendi reported to Orome are most likely the servants of Melkor. And here comes one of the most tragic and the saddest things to talk about when it comes to the history of Middle-earth. Although it is one of the most interesting, because of its nature, it also happens to be one of the saddest. And here's what it is. There were certain members of the Quendi who had awakened by the waters of Cuivienen, who were very much swayed by the deceits that were spread by the servants of Melkor. And they ventured apart from the group, apart from their brothers and sisters. And when they did so, they were harassed, captured, and kidnapped by the servants of Melkor. They were brought back to Utumno, and Tolkien says, I think almost verbatim, that by slow arts of cruelty over time and through many tortures, from these captured elves, Melkor breeds the race of orcs. Yes, the orcs are actually elves that have been twisted, tormented, and defiled, and turned into evil creatures utterly bent on death, violence, and bloodshed. Now, there is this is probably going to be one of the only times, although I know for a fact that there will be a couple of other occasions during which I will do this. There is one line within the text of the Silmarillion that is so incredibly powerful. I can't even begin to tell you how powerful it is, that describes the Melkor's breeding of the orcs from these elves that he's captured from Cuivienen. This line is so powerful that I can't describe it to you. I have to just read it to you verbatim. Otherwise, you won't be able to get the impact of it. Because I'm not well spoken, but Tolkien certainly is. I have to read you what it says. Just listen to these words. Trying to find it here. I'm twisting. Okay. On page, in my copy of the Silmarillion, it's on page 50, in the chapter of the Coming of the Elves, which is chapter 3 of the Quenta Silmarillion, page 50. In the second major paragraph on the page right before the break, it says, and deep in their dark hearts the orcs loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor and the most hateful to Illúvatar. That line gave me chills when I read it. Just think how these beautiful creatures, Illúvatar's own children, Melkor took them and he twisted them and turned them into creatures of dread, creatures that fed on blood, creatures that are hell-bent on violence and death, creatures that in fact hate him. In their heart of hearts, they hate Melkor as much as the elves do. But they've been twisted and thwarted to be his slaves. They serve the master whom, in their fear, they don't reveal that they actually hate. That line, it gave me absolute chills, and it is understandable 1,000,000,000% how this is the vilest deed of Melkor in Illúvatar's eyes. Because what did Melkor do? He took Illúvatar's own children. He took his children. He took his children and he twisted them and he thwarted them and he turned them into something ugly and something completely pitiable, something horrible, an abomination. He turned them into orcs. So now we know where the dwarves come from, we know where the orcs come from, and now we've seen the awakening of the elves. And without the text does not tell us whether or not the Valar are aware of the fact that Melkor has captured some of the Quendi and turn them into orcs. The text does not tell us whether they're aware of it, but I think it's kind of irrelevant whether they know or not, because after Orome tells them of the shadows that have been surrounding the Quendi and threatening them in Cuiviénen, Manwë departs from the council of the Valar. Once again, he mounts Taniquetil, he sits down on his high seat, and he prays to Ilúvatar from the very top of Arda, the topmost peak in Arda, the closest to the heavens, to the encircling seas. He prays to Ilúvatar for wisdom, and when he comes back down from Taniquetil, he summons the Valar once more to the Mahanaxar, the Ring of Doom, and he says, we are going to, this is a paraphrase, we're going to war for the sake of the elves. We are going to war for the sake of the elves. What is about to happen is one of only 2 instances in the entire history of Middle-earth in which the Valar will directly intervene in the tidings and goings-on of Middle-earth. There will only be one other time. That will be in a future episode. This is the first and one of only 2 times when they will do that. Aule is much grieved by this because he knows that just like happened, just like what happened with the destruction of the spring of Arda, with the destruction of the 2 lambs, all of their work is now about to be destroyed if they indeed do what Manwë says they're going to do. And they gather together their arms and they array themselves in forms of terror and forms of utter lordly power, and they travel to Middle-earth, and they assault Utumno. They assault the northern lands that Melkor has domination over. They bypass Angband without unroofing it, mind you. They bypass it, they attack the servants that are there at the gates, but they bypass it, and they chase down Melkor's servants all the way to Utumno, where, by the way, where Melkor has barricaded himself within the uttermost pit of Utumno. In other words, the bottommost pit, he's hiding himself. He's so afraid of the onslaught of the Valar that he hides himself within the uttermost pit of his own fortress. Well, that's not going to be any barrier to the Valar. Utumno is unroofed, its pits are laid bare, and Tulkas wrestles with Melkor, casts him to the ground, binds him with the chain on Gainor, which Aule had made. It's like an enchanted magical chain. He binds Melkor, drags him back to the Blessed Realm, brings him before the feet of the powers, before the feet of Manwë and Varda and Javanna and Ulmo. Remember, Tulkas is bringing Melkor blindfolded and bound with the chain on Gainor before the feet of the powers. Melkor falsely sues for pardon, sues for mercy. He doesn't really mean it. But Tulkas casts him on his face at the bidding of Manwë. He casts Melkor on his face. Melkor is then thrown into the fastness or the prison of Mandos, west of West, whence none can escape, and doomed to abide within the fastness of Mandos 3 ages long before his case will be tried anew before Manwë, his brother. Now that was a lot. That was the battle of the powers, the war for the sake of the elves. And Tolkien tells us that Melkor never forgot that this war was made for the sake of the elves. That the elves, in fact, were the cause of his downfall, or as we'll see, his first downfall. He never forgot it. Tolkien goes out of his way to tell us that, and we'll see why in the next episode. He never forgot that this war was made for the sake of the elves. And it's known as the Battle of the Powers within the text. It's not called the War for the Sake of the Elves. It is given that name because of that mysterious, ominous line that Tolkien says that Melkor never forgot that this war was made for the sake of the elves. That's why it is often referred to as the War for the Sake of the Elves, but really the proper name of this battle is known as the Battle of the Powers. And the Quendi, who are residing by the waters of Middle-earth, hear very little about the Battle of the Powers. The only things they really hear of it are hints that they are able to see and feel, because they feel the ground shaking, they see the waters of Cuiviénen churning and erupting, and they see great lights in the far north, lights as of many mighty fires. These are the only hints and signs that they see of the Battle of the Powers. So Melkor is cast within the fastness of Mandos, there to abide his doom 3 ages long, So he's going to be in the prison of Mandos for a long, long time. Long, long time. So now what happens? Orome returns after the Battle of the Powers. He returns to the Quendi by the waters of Cuiviénen, and he bids them to come and to follow him to the Blessed Realm. Now, before I mention that, there are two other things I want to mention. The first thing is that the Battle of the Powers brought about the second, albeit minor, change of the world. Remember that the first change of the world came with the destruction of the two lamps. The second change of the world is very, very minor. The second change of the world comes about with the Battle of the Powers. The chaos and the tumult that is caused by the coming of the Valar from Aman to Middle-earth is so great that what happens is that the Sea of Belagir actually grows wider along its belt, such that waters stream in along the coastlines of Middle-earth. Land isn't really destroyed as a result of the second change. It's just that water floods the coastlands of Middle-earth, creating, as it were, a bay along the girdle or along the belt of Middle-earth, and that bay becomes known as the Bay of Valar. And into the Bay of Valar are emptied the waters of the river Sirion in Beleriand, the great river Sirion in Beleriand. Just like Anduin is the great river of Middle-earth as we know it in the Lord of the Rings, so Sirion will be the great river, so to speak, of Beleriand in the Silmarillion. The waters of Sirion empty into the Bay of Valar, and Sirion actually originates at this point during the second change from highlands that were actually raised up within the land of Middle-earth. Highlands were raised up by the chaos and the tumults of the Battle of the Powers. These highlands are the regions of Dorthonion, and which will become known as Tower Nu Fuin, and Heathlum. Heathlum and Dorthonion are two regions of Beleriand that we will be speaking about. To say extensively would be a huge understatement. Almost every single episode throughout the duration of our studying of the Silmarillion. So Heathlum and Dorthonion at this point are great highlands and plateaus of Beleriand. They are actually created as a result of the tumults of the Battle of the Powers, and the Bay of Valar is created as well. All of the bays of Middle-earth are widened and made bigger. Belagir is made wider, and the small land strip that connects Aman in its northeast to Beleriand in its northwest is made ever thinner along the Helcaraxe, the grinding ice, this area of absolute cold where there is only ice, broken ice in places connecting Aman, the Blessed Realm, and Middle-earth. So that comes with the change of the world, the second change of the world, which is a minor change. The other thing I wanted to mention before we get to the elves' response to Orome's request is that Orome's request really arises from a decision made by the Valar in council in a vote. Following the Battle of the Powers, the Valar come together and they say, listen, Melkor is now in prison in the fastness of Mandos. We don't really have to worry about him anymore. But we know that the evil and the tumults and the darkness that he cast upon Middle-earth remain. Though he himself is in prison, the fruits of his works remain, and they endanger the lives of the Quendi as long as they live in Middle-earth. So shall we allow them to heal the hurts of Arda, of Middle-earth, as best they please, as the children of Illúvatar, with the graces that he has endowed to them? Shall we let them come to their own and come into their own and grow and live in their independence, or shall we summon them home? Shall we summon them here and have them live here on the Deathless Shores in the light of the Blessed Realm and in the light of the two trees? The Valar as a council together, majority vote yes to bring them to live at the feet of the powers and to live in the light of the Blessed Realm. But this decision grieves Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, grieves him. He is against it. He believes that the Quendi should work out their own fate and have independence within Arda, and that they should be able, with the graces endowed to them by Illúvatar, to heal the hurts of Middle-earth caused by Melkor's darkness as best they please. So he's really against this decision. And as we'll see in a little bit, Ose, his servant, is also against this decision. But this is the decision made by the council. Now, I would like to point something out. Once this decision is made, remember Mandos? Namo is his actual name, but he's called Mandos because of the region in which he lives within the Blessed Realm, which is called Mandos, or the Halls of Mandos. Namo, or Mandos, his job is pronouncing the doom that he foresees in the foresight that has been given to him, but he only pronounces his knowledge of the future at the bidding of Manwe. So him and Manwe are like this. They're super close. Mandos doesn't do anything without the bidding of Manwe. So it just so happens after the Valar reach this decision to summon the Quendi, to summon the elves to live in the Blessed Realm, Mando says, "So it is doomed." And Tolkien says, "And these words foretell many woes that afterwards befell as a result of this decision." It seems as if this decision was not good, or that it will not prove to be a good one in the future. And what I'm really getting at here is this. If Mandos does not do anything without the bidding of Manwe, and he says, "So it is doomed," does that not then mean that Manwe himself was against the decision to bring the Quendi to the Blessed Realm from the very beginning? And if indeed Manwe is Ilúvatar's Vicar, does that not also mean, or is it too much of a stretch to say that Ilúvatar himself was against the decision of the Valar to bring the Quendi to the Blessed Realm? I would suggest to you that it is. That in fact, not only was Ulmo and Ose against the decision, but Manwe and Ilúvatar himself were against the decision to bring the elves to Middle-earth. And so very briefly, I would like to summarize what happens in this great journey of the elves to the Blessed Realm. And then once I complete the telling of the great journey from beginning to end, we will end this video and we will begin next week's video with the life of the elves in the Blessed Realm. We're going to end today's video with the arrival of the elves in the Blessed Realm. So here's the story of the great journey. Orome approaches the Quendi by the waters of Cuiviénen and he invites them. He says, come live with us in the light and splendor of the Blessed Realm. Now, mind you, many of the Quendi, most of the Quendi say yes. Yes, we will follow you. Remember, they see the light of Aman in Orome's face. How could they really say no? There are many of the Quendi, many of them, who refuse the summons altogether and never begin the journey. They are called the Avari, which is an Elvish word meaning the unwilling. They never begin the journey west. They remain in Middle-earth for their entire eternity, their entire immortality, because remember, elves cannot die. They can only fade, which is a topic we'll talk about in a later video. The Avari never begin the journey. Now, I should tell you, what was it that prompted the Quendi to so readily accept Orome's invitation? Well, Orome knew that because of the deceits of Melkor that the Quendi were somewhat afraid of him. Even if all of them weren't afraid of him, for the most part he would have to really win their collective trust. So what did he do? He sought out the three greatest from among them, three lords, if you will, of the Quendi. He summoned them to be ambassadors, to journey with him to the Blessed Realm and back, to speak to the Valar and then deliver the message of the Valar back to their people in Cuiviénen. And that's exactly what he does. So who are the names of these three ambassadors? Ingwe, who will become the father of the Vanyar, Finwë, who will become the father of the Noldor, and Elwë, who will become the father of the Teleri. The Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë speak to the powers in the Blessed Realm, and they return with Orome back to Cuiviénen, and they speak to their people, and they encourage their people, saying, we should go. We have seen the light of the Blessed Realm, and you need to see it too. The light and the splendor and the joy of the Blessed Realm is in the faces of Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë as their people see them, and then their people say, well, if they're telling us we should go, then we really should go. We really should go. And so the great journey begins. So the great journey to the west begins, and it is right here, that the doom that Mandos pronounced is about to begin the course of its history, the doom that Mandos pronounced is about to begin with this yes that the elves give to their lords Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë after Orome invites them to come to the light of the Blessed Realm. So they begin the great journey west. And you know what? As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to pause the video right here, and I think we will pick up exactly here next week. So, thank you for watching. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. May the grace of the Valar be with you. And I will see you again next Sunday. So please, don't tarry too far outside the waters of Cuiviénen. And always remember, always remember that the light of the Blessed Realm lives within the hearts of all those whom we love. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again next week. Tune in, please, next Sunday so that you can finally hear the full history of the great journey, the arrival of the elves in the Blessed Realm, and the life of the elves in Aman, in Valinor. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week. God bless.